News of another plane crash in Nepal and a report on the country's horrid aviation record. In the UK, the King's income soars and the National Health Service crumbles. In Paris, a gang rape just before the Olympic Games begin. How China's economic slowdown is hitting global luxury brands. While landslides kill hundreds of people in Ethiopia every year. And what is an emotional hangover? How can you fix it? All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Ukraine tells China that Russia is not ready for quote-unquote good faith talks to end the war. Ukraine's foreign minister made that remark during his trip to China. He is the first senior official to visit China since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Beijing, Moscow's most important ally, is trying to mediate in this war. In India, opposition MPs protest inside and outside Parliament. They are unhappy with the union budget, which was presented yesterday. The MPs claim the budget discriminates against the opposition-ruled states. The budget has earmarked significant projects for Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. These are states whose leaders are part of the ruling coalition. Mobile internet services restored in Mauritania. It comes after a 22-hour blackout, which was linked to protests. The demonstrators were angry over the re-election of the president. The internet services have been restored just days ahead of the president's swearing-in ceremony. Typhoon Gemi blows past the Philippines. Relentless rain triggers floods in the capital. A state of calamity declared in Manila. In Taiwan, schools closed and thousands evacuated as the cyclone makes landfall. School summer holidays will be extended by 2 weeks in southern Pakistan. This is due to soaring temperatures. More than 100,000 schools will be affected. Pakistan saw a series of heat waves in May and June with temperatures going above 50 degrees Celsius. And Ferrari to accept crypto payments in Europe. This follows a similar move in the US. The new payment system will be rolled out from the end of July. In 2021, Elon Musk had said that he would sell Tesla cars for bitcoins, but later he changed his mind. Let's start with a million-dollar question. Can Kamala Harris beat Donald Trump? It's shaping into a contest. A few days ago, Trump seemed invincible. The attempt on his life led to a groundswell of support. It ended the re-election campaign of a sitting president. Headlines said the bullet hit Trump, but it killed Biden's bid. Now Biden is out and the plot is shifting. Kamala Harris is gaining ground. A new poll is out. It shows Harris in the lead over Trump. It's a small lead, barely 2 percentage points, but it's a lead nonetheless. According to this poll, 44% voters support Kamala Harris. 44%. 42% are for Donald Trump. What about the rest? 5% voters want a different candidate. The remaining 9% are undecided. Now, let me add here that this is just one poll, and Harris only has a marginal lead. Nonetheless, these numbers should alarm Trump. This is the first poll to come out after the Republican convention and Biden's announcement. Trump was the star of the convention. He won the nomination hands down. It was a coronation of sorts. Trump was riding a high, and the election victory looked achievable. Compare this with Kamala Harris, starting a late campaign, doesn't have a running mate yet, and is yet to officially secure her party's nomination. She is the underdog, yet she's beaten Trump in the first poll of this week.
There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement for Kamala. She's obviously raising a ton of money. This is her first public event since she became the presumptive nominee. Certainly, she's a good person to take the case against Trump.
First of all, she can take down Trump in a heartbeat. She can eviscerate him with her words. She is by far the most superior candidate we have right now, obviously.
At the risk of sounding repetitive, let me add that polls are not the final deal. They can get things wrong. Just look at the exit polls of India, which were way off the mark. Or ask Hillary Clinton. She lost to Trump in 2016 despite doing well in polls. So take them with more than a pinch of salt. And yet polls matter because they help in gauging the voter sentiment, the broad trend of an election. And based on these numbers, Harris may or may not be able to beat Trump, but he's not running away with the election just yet. It is going to be a fight. The pollsters asked some specific questions about the candidates, like who is more sharp mentally? Who is sharper? 56% of the voters said Harris is sharper than Trump and Biden. That's a valuable insight for Kamala Harris and her advisors. The Democratic convention is weeks away. The party is working to reposition Kamala Harris. They want to create a strong narrative for her campaign. And yesterday we saw the first signs of this. Harris held her first campaign event and she attacked Donald Trump.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain.
She's making progress on other fronts as well. In the last 2 days, she has whipped up endorsements from hundreds of Democrats. Yesterday, top Democrats in the U.S. Congress endorsed Harris.
She said she would work to earn the support of our party, and boy, has she done so in quick order. Vice President Harris has done a truly impressive job securing the majority of delegates needed to win the Democratic Party's nomination to be our next president of the United States.
She now has enough votes to secure her party's nomination. There are no visible signs of dissent or opposition to her within the party. Plus, the money is flowing in. Democratic donors have sent more than $100 million to the Harris campaign. After she replaced Joe Biden, Harris and the Democrats have raised a whopping $250 million in the past few days. This money was raised in a little over 40 hours after Biden's announcement. $250 million in 40 hours. So from endorsements to fundraising and most crucially mass support, Kamala Harris seems to be ticking all the boxes. Meanwhile, the Republicans are amping up the attacks. They want to slow down Harris. The Trump camp has filed a complaint over Joe Biden's campaign funds. That's more than $90 million. That's the money that Biden had raised. But when he dropped out of the race, the money went to Kamala Harris. Her campaign moved the Federal Election Commission. That is America's election watchdog, the Federal Election Commission. And they replaced Biden's name with that of Harris. So the money went to Kamala Harris. So now she controls Biden's war chest. The Trump camp has complained against this. They argue that this money cannot be transferred. In fact, let me quote from the complaint. This effort makes a mockery of our campaign finance laws. So Trump is targeting Harris's funds. His party is going after her track record, especially her failure to tackle immigration.
And Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's open border czar. By every metric, Harris has failed to secure our borders, advancing far-left Democrats' failed open border policies and the needs of illegals over the safety of American citizens.
So the Republicans are going after Kamala Harris, all guns blazing. Their top party leaders say they should tone it down. Apparently, some instructions have been issued to stop attacking Kamala Harris on her race, gender, and identity, and to focus more on her policies. Not sure if Donald Trump and J.D. Vance got the memo.
Regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East.
We want to push Netanyahu, our prime minister. We want him to push harder for getting this deal.
It's been a chaotic few weeks for America. There was Donald Trump shooting, Joe Biden's exit from the race, and Kamala Harris's entry. So their domestic politics is going through a churn, and amid all of this, America has a guest. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. He landed in Washington yesterday, and since then, he's kept a low profile. He's met a few officials, he met families of hostages, and he's talked about a peace deal.
We are determined to bring them all back. The conditions to bring them back are ripening for the simple reason that we are putting very, very strong pressure on Hamas. We are seeing a certain change, and I think this change will grow.
So all in all, a productive 24 hours, but nothing too flashy. What about today? What's on Netanyahu's agenda? He will address a joint session of the US Congress, which is also the main purpose of his visit, to address this session. On Thursday, he will meet Joe Biden. He's also expected to meet Kamala Harris. And on Friday, he'll reunite with an old friend, Donald Trump. They'll meet at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. So it's quite a busy week for the Israeli Prime Minister. But why exactly is he in the US at a time when his country is at war? The Israeli army is pounding Gaza. There are new strikes every day. Meanwhile, other fronts are opening up in West Asia. In the north, there's the Hezbollah. Israel is preparing for a possible war with them. In the south, there's Yemen, from where the Houthis are striking Israel. So there's danger on all sides. At a time like this, what is the Israeli Prime Minister doing 2,000 kilometers away?
At a time when Israel is fighting on 7 fronts and when there's great political uncertainty in Washington, I will address for the 4th time both houses of Congress as the Prime Minister of Israel. I will seek to anchor the bipartisan support that is so important for Israel.
So the visit is to boost support. This is Netanyahu's first trip since the war began. He's facing pressure at home. Israeli citizens want him to sign a peace deal. They want the hostages back.
We came to protest in order for our Prime Minister to stop the abandonment of the hostages and bring them home as fast as possible and to sign the deal which is on the table for so many months.
So he's losing support at home and losing friends abroad. With the war dragging on and the death toll mounting, countries are slamming Israel's actions. Netanyahu is under international pressure, and this trip to the US is meant to ease the pressure. After all, the US is Israel's biggest ally. They may have had disagreements, but that has not stopped the military aid, which makes this the perfect opportunity for Netanyahu. In America, he can show that he is a global statesman and that there's still support for his war. On paper, it's a great plan, but the timing is terrible. One of the few things you cannot blame Netanyahu for. This trip was planned weeks ago. So much has changed since then. America's volatile politics may dampen his tour. Washington has a lot on its plate, and none of it involves Netanyahu. So he may not like being upstaged, but he will be this time. Plus, his visit is a controversial one. The Gaza war is a very divisive issue in the US. It has spurred protests. It has divided college campuses. It has even led to arrests. So the Israeli Prime Minister has only sparked more tension by landing in the US. He'll meet with more protests from pro-Palestinian groups who plan to gather outside the US Capitol. And this raises security concerns. Plus, some American lawmakers are boycotting Netanyahu's speech.
All of us who care about our partnership, both in America and in Israel, should understand the enormous damage that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his current extremist government coalition are doing to our relationship and to Israel's standing in the world. So, Mr. President, it sends a terrible message to bring him here now to address a joint session of Congress.
Then there's Kamala Harris. On a normal day, she would be sitting behind Netanyahu during his speech. After all, she is the Senate leader. She presides over such events. But not this time. She will be away on a campaign trip. Her team hasn't said anything about this, but it's believed that she wants to distance herself from him. It's election season. Harris is the presumptive Democratic nominee, and to win, she needs the Arab American votes. They're crucial to flip the swing states. So Netanyahu's visit puts her in a bind. And she's not the only one navigating a minefield here. Netanyahu himself will also have to play his cards carefully. In an election year, he cannot afford to be too cozy with either side.
I will tell my friends on both sides of the aisle that regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East.
So he's walking a political tightrope. Netanyahu came to Washington hoping to be the star of the show. He wanted to be on the front page, but at this rate, he'll be happy if he finds a mention in the papers at all. Bangladesh is slowly coming back online. Internet services have been cut for 5 days, had been cut for 5 days. They're now being restored. And as communications resume, images of what transpired last week are being shared. And I must say, the visuals are disturbing. These are pictures from Bangladesh. They show what took place over the last few days. It was like a war zone with violent clashes between the armed forces and protesters. Things are now calm. The violence has largely subsided, and the internet, as we said, has been partially restored. But things are far from normal in Bangladesh. Beneath the return of peace, there's an undercurrent of public anger, which may erupt in the form of new protests in the coming days. The recent protests began as a student movement. They were initially peaceful and directed against job reservations, job quotas. About 56% of government jobs in Bangladesh were reserved for different groups of people, including the children and grandchildren of freedom fighters. This restricted job access for ordinary citizens. They could apply for less than half the jobs on offer. 56% were reserved. And that is why the students were protesting. Peacefully initially, but soon the protests turned violent. Last week, there were reports of clashes between the protesters and members of Bangladesh's ruling party, members of their youth league. Hundreds were injured in those clashes, and the demonstrators were enraged. They decided to fight fire with fire, and that is when the protests turned deadly. The demonstrators clashed with the police. They set the state broadcaster's office on fire. The situation got out of hand, and Bangladesh's government responded with a crackdown. The internet was shut last Thursday. The protests were being organized on social media, so a social media blackout was put in place, and news coming out of Bangladesh slowed to a trickle. A nationwide curfew was imposed, the army was brought in, and the government's forces were given extraordinary powers, including orders to shoot at sight. The visuals you've seen are a direct result of that. Bangladesh's forces were given a free rein. They no longer had to use non-lethal force, and so you had scenes like this. A Type 56 assault rifle being fired by the border guard of Bangladesh at the country's own civilians. The Bangladeshi police made use of shotguns, and they replaced rubber bullets with the real thing. At least 150 people are dead now. Some of them were protesters, others merely bystanders. But scores of people were killed and thousands were injured. Hospitals have been working overtime trying to help pellet and gunshot victims. But why did the Bangladeshi forces resort to such heavy-handed measures? They argue that they had no choice.
An anarchic situation was created in the country. Many people's assets were destroyed, so the army was appointed to save it and ensure public security. We were deployed after the appointment. I think some sort of normalcy returned after 48 hours of army deployment.
The military deployment has brought a somewhat uneasy calm to Bangladesh. But that wasn't the only reason. The bigger reason was a verdict by their Supreme Court. On Sunday, the country's apex court passed an order. It scrapped most of the job reservations, which was the original reason for the protests. So Bangladesh's Supreme Court offered a solution.
The solution is that, considering the current perspective, the general public will have 93% of the total jobs, and 7% will be for quotas, where 5% will be for the children and grandchildren of the freedom fighters, 1% for ethnic minorities, and 1% for the disabled and members of the third gender.
Now, instead of more than half the jobs being reserved, only 7% of them will be set aside. 93% of all government jobs in Bangladesh are now open to the general public. Only 7% reservation. So it seems the students got what they wanted. That is why calm is returning. Bangladesh's nationwide curfew was partially lifted today. Businesses were allowed to stay open from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Traffic returned to the streets of the capital, Dhaka, but it's still far from business as usual.
We are not retreating from our movement. We will continue our protests until the clear resolution of the demands raised by the people who joined the movement and justice to the killing and injuries is served.
Some protest organizers have issued new demands like the complete restoration of the internet and an end to the curfew. They also want justice for the people killed or injured during the protests. The protesters faced their own country's armed forces. They were shot at with assault rifles and shotguns. It was done to maintain law and order and to prevent damage to public property. But was it the only way? Did the Bangladeshi forces have to turn to weapons of war against their own people? These actions may have long-term repercussions. Anti-government sentiment could fester and haunt Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina for years to come. We move from one protest to another and turn our attention to Kenya, where the embattled president is making another gambit. Kenya's President William Ruto is under immense pressure. He is struggling to contain public anger. For those of you who don't know, Kenya has been facing protests for weeks now. They began in mid-June. People took to the streets to protest against the country's annual budget. The Finance Bill 2024, that's what the budget was called. Ruto's government wanted to raise taxes. He wanted to tax basics like bread and fuel. But the people were having none of it. Young Kenyans organized themselves on social media. Gen Z led the charge here, and soon thousands were out on the streets. On June 25th, the protesters stormed the Parliament building, and they forced Ruto to back down. He scrapped his own finance bill and withdrew the proposed new taxes. But by then it was too late. The protests had morphed. They were no longer just about taxes. Instead, the target had become Ruto himself. You can hear the same chant at every single protest. Ruto must go. That is the protest anthem. The Kenyan protesters blame Ruto for the mess the country is in. Ruto has been raising taxes since he became president in 2022. This has exacerbated the cost of living crisis in Kenya. People say they cannot pay anymore, which is why the protest began. But Ruto responded with force. Police brutality was on full display. At least 50 people have been killed and dozens of others are injured. This angered the protesters who blamed Ruto for the brutality. They want accountability for the lives lost, and they want Ruto to resign. But the president shows no sign of stepping down. Instead, he is trying everything to placate the protesters. First, he scrapped the controversial finance bill. Then he tried talking to the protesters. Ruto took part in an online debate with them, but that did not help. After this, he tried a government reshuffle. He fired most of his cabinet and promised a reset. Since then, he's been restoring his cabinet. Last week, he appointed 11 people, 6 old faces, 5 new ones. Of course, that's not really a complete reset. So today, he went to greater lengths. He appointed 4 more people to the cabinet, and this time all of them are new. In fact, they aren't even members of his political party. These 4 new appointees are members of the opposition, allies of Ruto's biggest rival, Raila Odinga. That is how far William Ruto is willing to go. He has given Kenya's key ministries to his rivals, finance and energy given to the opposition, in the hopes that this will end the protests. Ruto also said that he will address a major public concern, corruption.
I have this to say to Kenyans. I have heard you, and I have heard you clearly. I will be proposing amendments to the Evidence Act and the Criminal Procedure Code, among other necessary legislative amendments to all statutes relating to corruption, to expedite investigations and prosecution of corruption and economic crimes cases, and provide for their conclusion within 6 months.
Will today's moves work? Will the people of Kenya finally calm down? It seems unlikely. Here's why I say this. Here are some of the initial reactions that have come in. One person said it was the politics of self-interest. Another said that the fight would not end. A third said that Ruto had, quote-unquote, appointed corrupt people to fight corruption. These 3 don't seem to want to stand down, and others may not either. Today, Ruto said that he has heard the people of Kenya clearly. But for weeks, this is what the people of Kenya have been saying. Unless he manages to change that chant, unless he changes hearts and minds, the Kenyan protests won't die down, no matter who Ruto appoints to his cabinet. Now let's talk about Nepal, a country edging closer towards becoming a failed state. Its politics is in constant turmoil. In Nepal, governments change more often than the weather. Unemployment is widespread. Last month, over 12% of Nepal's workforce was unemployed. Every year, at least 1 million people leave the country permanently. To make things worse, Nepal's skies are unsafe too. Today, another plane crashed in Kathmandu. There were 19 people on board. Only the pilot has survived. Our next report has more details.
These were the final minutes of flight number 9NAME. The plane was taking off from Kathmandu. Barely a few minutes later, it turned into a fireball.
At first, the smoke was coming out. We did not realize that the plane had crashed. After going there, we realized that the plane had crashed. They were taking out a few dead people. The plane broke into 2 pieces and dead people kept coming out.
There were 19 people on this plane. 18 died. The pilot of the plane was the only survivor. This plane was operated by Saurya Airlines, a local carrier. It had taken off from Kathmandu earlier in the day and was on its way to Pokhara, a popular tourism hub. While it's too early to draw conclusions, local authorities have conducted an initial assessment. They believe this plane was flying in the wrong direction. The Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu is Nepal's main airport. Both domestic and international flights operate out of here. The crash shut down this airport for several hours as emergency workers and investigators got to work. Unfortunately, this is a story that keeps repeating itself. Nepal has one of the worst air safety records in the world. In the last 30 years, over 50 flights have crashed in Nepal. One big reason for this is the tricky operating conditions. The Kathmandu airport is built inside a valley. It's surrounded by mountains on both sides. The visibility is also poor. This makes it challenging for pilots to fly in and out of here. To land at this airport, they must navigate an opening in the mountains to land. Add to that the weather. Often the conditions change quickly. This makes the pilot's job very tough. In one word, Nepal has one of the most hostile conditions for pilots to fly. This makes the job of the regulators very important. In Nepal, this responsibility falls to the government and the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal. Both institutions often face criticism for their approach. Experts point towards serious gaps in the training of the operators and maintenance of aircraft. Nepal's government is responsible for both regulating the planes and operating the airports. Many see this as a clear conflict of interest. Last year, a Yeti Airlines flight crashed in Pokhara. It was one of Nepal's worst air disasters in decades. Over 70 people died. After today's crash, it seems no lessons were learnt. It's high time for Nepal to reflect, rectify, and make its skies safer.
Our next story is from the UK, or rather we have 2 stories from this country. 2 contrasting tales, one of wealth and riches, the other of neglect and destitution. We start with a story about riches. Yesterday, the British public received a report about a company called the Crown Estate. Now, this is a major real estate company. It has assets worth $16 billion. That's more than 16 billion pounds. That's more than $20 billion. Now, this company, the Crown Estate, made some good profits last year, about $1.4 billion in profit. So the British people can expect great sums of money to bypass them and instead go to their royal family, because if you haven't already guessed, the Crown Estate exists to serve the British Crown. The company manages land owned by the monarchy. This land includes vast rural fields, prime real estate in London, and the seabed around England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Yes, you heard that right. The seabed, the ocean floor, where the British beaches end, the royal family's domain begins. This seabed is actually the reason that the company is doing so well. Over the last few years, Britain has been investing in green energy like wind power. Some wind farms are being set up near the shore, a little out at sea. This means that they're technically being built on royal land. And this has been a gift for the royal family, the British royal family. The Crown Estate has made a fortune on the seabed, which means the British royals are about to get richer. How much richer? Well, next year, they will be given about $58 million extra. Here's how it works. The British monarchy is given some money by Parliament every year. It's called a sovereign grant. The value of this grant, the sovereign grant, depends on the money generated by the Crown Estate. Because the Crown Estate has made extra profits, Charles and the gang have extra pocket money next year. Now, some of you might think this is only fair. The Crown Estate generates money and only a cut of that money goes to the monarchy. And that is technically true. But how on earth are they allowed to profit from the seabed? Can a normal person do something like that? Will any normal government allow a citizen to profit from the seabed? Of course not. This extra seabed money should have all gone to the government, but instead, Charles will be spending it on upgrading his castle. This is just one of the ways that the monarchy ends up bleeding Britain. Let's take another. The duchies. Charles has one, the Duchy of Lancaster. It's considered his private estate, even though neither he nor his ancestors paid for it. Nonetheless, it generates millions for him every year. His son William has one of these duchies as well, the Duchy of Cornwall. It's another multi-million-pound income source. Despite these existing ill-gotten gains, the British royals continue to take a cut of seabed money as well, and their payday doesn't stop here. Anti-monarchy groups have come out with an estimate. They say that the royal family costs British taxpayers £345 million a year. £345 million a year, that's almost $450 million every year. We are in the year 2024 and the British royal family still mints money as if it's the year 1024. That is quite the tale of wealth spanning the centuries. And now for our second story from the UK, the tale of neglect and destitution, the tale of the NHS, the National Health Service. Britain's National Health Service is in tatters. Here's one headline from today about how the NHS won't be able to find a dentist for an area till 2025. It's one of many depressing NHS stories that you see daily. The UK's National Health Service has been systematically underfunded for years now. People can't get appointments for months. There's always a shortage of staff. Doctors are overworked and underpaid. There is just no relief. The NHS has been crumbling for years, while the monarchy is minting money on seabed rentals. The contrast is stark and absurd. It's time the country decides what is more important, a once powerful family with billions in dubious real estate or their literal lifeline. Our next story looks at Paris. All eyes are on the French capital. It is hosting the Olympic Games. The Games begin on Friday. Officials say Paris will be the safest place in the world ahead of the Games. But the headlines don't bear this out. There's been a gang rape in the French capital. A 25-year-old tourist was raped by 5 men. No arrests have been made yet. The French police are still investigating. And while this case has shocked people, Paris is no stranger to incidents like this. And it's adding fuel to the political fire there. France's far right blames it on the rise of immigration. Is there merit to this charge? Our next report tells you.
It was around 5 a.m. on Saturday. But this kebab shop was open in Paris. It had a fair amount of customers. That's when a young woman walked in. She looked disoriented, she was unable to speak, her dress was partially torn off, and she was wearing it backwards. Soon, the terrified woman asks for help. She tells the staff she's been gang raped by 5 men. The alarmed staff surround her. Other customers try to comfort her. That's when a man enters the kebab shop. He walks up to her and he pats her back. That's when the woman gestures that he is one of the attackers. A customer confronts him. And the man flees. He hasn't been seen since then. When the police arrived at the scene, the woman narrated her ordeal. She's a 25-year-old Australian woman. She was a tourist in the city. And she was raped overnight by a gang of 5 men. Not much else is known about her testimony, but the woman said her attackers were men of quote-unquote African appearance. The French police are now investigating the incident. The Australian embassy has offered consular assistance. She had initially planned to fly back home, but later decided to stay in France. No other information has been provided. It's to respect her privacy. This incident comes just days ahead of the Paris Olympics. Right now, the French capital is almost under a lockdown. There's a huge police presence. 45,000 police officers are patrolling the streets. It's to protect the athletes and all those who will be in the city for the games. So the question is, how did an incident like this take place amid all this surveillance? And it's not the first such case in Paris. In June, a British woman was allegedly gang raped in the French capital. That incident took place just minutes away from the location of Saturday's attack. In that same month, a 12-year-old Jewish girl was raped in an abandoned warehouse. In January, an American woman was raped in the city. She says she was dumped on the side of the road. In 2023, there were 93 rapes committed in public places in Paris. It's 2% higher than 2022. 77% of these rapes were committed by perpetrators who do not hold French passports. Majority of them happened around tourist areas like Champ de Mars. Most of the perpetrators were drug addicts. They were also homeless and unemployed. 20 of them were already known to the police. That means they have been pulled up before, for other crimes. France's far-right groups have blamed this on the rise of immigration. But reports suggest it's also a way to villainize migrants. Either way, this new incident raises a lot of questions for Paris. The French capital is hoping to welcome 1 million people for the Olympics. The games are set to be the most heavily policed in history. But the question remains, is Paris truly safe?
Now let's talk about China. Its struggling economy has taken another victim. After jobs, housing and the stock markets, luxury retailers are suffering because the sales of luxury goods are down. And the drop is so significant that retailers are blaming China publicly for the falling sales. This week, LVMH released its results. This is the company that owns brands like Louis Vuitton and Dior. It's the world's largest luxury group. LVMH revenues from Asia are down. In the first half of this year, they dropped by 14%. And one big reason for this is China. Chinese consumers are not spending enough, not as much as they used to on luxury items. And LVMH is not the only one at the receiving end. Hugo Boss is also struggling in China. They say the Chinese market, and I'm quoting, is particularly challenging today. British fashion brand Burberry is not mincing words either. Burberry sales in China have dropped by 21%. The brand says the Chinese market has been quote-unquote weaker than we expected. They say consumer confidence is deteriorating. Swiss watch brand Swatch has the same view. It has seen a 14% drop in overall sales. It says the Chinese market won't improve anytime soon. In fact, I have a quote from the company. It says the Chinese market will remain challenging for the entire luxury goods industry until the end of this year. So the trend is quite clear. China is the world's second largest economy. It is a big market for luxury products. Close to 35% of all luxury goods made in the world are bought by the Chinese, 35%. But the people of China aren't buying as much as they used to now. What explains this dip? One reason being given is the state of the Chinese economy. It remains gloomy, growth is down, unemployment remains high. Earlier this month, Beijing admitted that it faces some significant economic challenges.
The main issues are insufficient effective demand, difficulties in business operations for some enterprises, and financial difficulties in some localities. This indicates that our economic recovery is not yet strong enough, and there are differentiation phenomena among different regions, industries, and enterprises. In the next step, we must promote sustained economic recovery and improvement, achieving more balanced, inclusive, and comprehensive development.
There are financial difficulties in some localities. The people of China are certainly feeling it, so they want to hold on to their savings. By the end of 2023, Chinese households had 138 trillion yuan in banks. That's almost 20 trillion US dollars. It's not a small number at all. 20 trillion US dollars in banks. When people keep so much money in banks, they're usually worried about the future. They want to save more and spend less, especially on non-essential goods like luxury. So this could be one of the reasons. But it's not even half the story. Because beneath this data, China is witnessing a cultural shift as well. Increasingly, luxury products are being frowned upon. Luxury shaming is on the rise in China. A recent report by Bain & Company referred to this trend. They studied the state of luxury shopping in China, and this is what they found. People are increasingly ditching luxury goods because it gives you a bad rep. People are now hesitant to buy or flaunt luxury products. And this trend is courtesy their president, Xi Jinping. He launched a campaign against wealth disparity. He is known to dislike public displays of wealth, and he's making a push for austerity by issuing diktats like this one. It came out last year. There was a crackdown on Chinese bankers. They were told to not wear expensive clothes or watches. They were asked to rein in expenses on things like travel and entertainment. That's where it started, the luxury shaming in China. And now it's spreading across the society. This is obviously bad news for luxury brands because such purchases are to maintain or secure a status. These goods are aspirational. People like to show them off. These brands symbolize prosperity, a higher social status. In China, they can put a target on your back now. This should explain the sliding sales. Now let's turn our attention to East Africa, where Ethiopia has been hit by torrential rainfall. Multiple deadly landslides have devastated the southern region of Gofa, leaving thousands of people displaced and killing at least 229 people. While search operations are speeding up, the death toll is expected to increase dramatically. It is a race against time for the residents who are scrambling to find more survivors. They're digging through the mud with their bare hands. Here's a report.
A hillside collapsed. At least 229 people dead. Hundreds of others helpless and grieving, using bare hands to dig through the dirt, looking for their loved ones, unwilling to give up hope. This is Ethiopia, the East African country. These visuals are from its southern Gofa region, a remote mountainous area which was hit by heavy rains on Sunday. The rainfall caused a landslide, killing dozens of people. By Monday morning, rescue operations were underway. Police officers were at the scene. Doctors, teachers and residents volunteered to help. They were frantically searching for survivors, but the worst was far from over. That's when a second landslide occurred. It buried them under the mud as well, along with other residents who were grappling for survival.
The devastation is huge and beyond our capacity. As a result, there are a lot of people who were uprooted from their livelihoods in the area. The area is now uninhabitable. We need to also work on relocating these people.
The incident happened following heavy rains. The damage is heavy. It is a very sad incident. We are transporting the injured to health facilities and hospitals. We are trying to gather people who lost their houses.
As of now, the rainfall has reduced in intensity. Rescue operations are speeding up. But so is the death toll. In a matter of hours, numbers are shooting up, and it seems they are expected to get worse.
The number of dead is increasing a lot. The number can go high, much more than this, as the number of people who rush to the scene to help with the rescue lead to the discovery of a massive second wave.
But with the numbers increasing, something else is rising as well. Anger among the people. Ethiopia is no stranger to deaths from deluge. This is an annual affair for the country. Year after year, Ethiopia is battered by short seasonal rains. The worst period is between April to June, and within a span of months, they devastate the nation. There's severe flooding, mass displacement, hunger, injuries and loss of livelihoods and loved ones. This year, in the month of May itself, close to 20,000 people were impacted and over 1,000 were displaced. Such flooding has only gotten worse due to climate change. So locals lean on each other. They have to use their bare hands to dig through the mud because the Ethiopian government is barely lending them a helping hand.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In France, the Olympic torch relay passes through the Palace of Versailles. A para-athlete sets the record for the longest handstand on a skateboard. And Taylor Swift's most iconic outfits find a new home at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. Finally, taking you back in history, on this day in 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins successfully returned to Earth after landing on the moon. The three astronauts splashed in the Pacific after spending more than 8 days in space. With that, the final leg of Apollo 11 came to an end. We're leaving you on that note. Thank you for watching. We will see you tomorrow.
Hello and welcome to the Late Night Edition with me, Ayushman Singh Jamwal. Ladies and gentlemen, breaking news coming in at the top of the bulletin on the death of a civil service aspirant who died due to electrocution in Patel Nagar in the national capital. Now, Delhi Minister Atishi has written to the Chief Secretary directing him to initiate an inquiry and suggest punitive action. She has sought a report by